Hello and welcome to the GoodPractice Podcast, a weekly show about work, performance and learning. I'm Ross Garner, and this week we're asking, are we failing our profession? I'm joined as usual by regular contributor Owen Ferguson. Hello Owen.
Hello Ross.
And our special guest this week from HMRC is Andrew Jacobs. Hello Andrew.
Hello.
Andrew, you suggested this topic, so do you want to get us started by explaining why we're talking about failing our profession at all?
It was it came about from a conversation I had with somebody a little while ago where they said, well, learning and development, we need to move it on a bit, we need to develop ourselves. I'm thinking, well, I'm sure I wrote something like that about 5 years ago. And I went hunting through my old blog posts, and yes, that was exactly it. The questions they were asking about, well, how do we move quicker, and how do we change, and how do we develop? And it's the same conversations that we're still having now that we were having some time ago. And then it came to, all right, so if we're failing our profession in some form, or if we're not moving forward, then how are we being failed? Are we failing the profession? Are we not moving forward as we should have been? So whose job is it to develop us and make us better at our job?
All right. In what ways are we failing?
Well, I see so many... the most common thing is people come up to me and say, how can I be better at my job? How can I be better at learning and development? How can I do these things? How can I understand how to do these things better? And you say, well, the LPI's capability map, which I know has just been revised, or you go to the CIPD's, new skills framework, which I know has just been revised. But you look at those things and they're still saying the same things that we've always done, and I accept absolutely that they need to try and move with the times, and I accept that they're enormous organisations and have a difficulty moving things forward, but we need to be more agile and not be afraid to take some risks around how we can develop ourselves, particularly if we're trying to sell this back into businesses ourselves. We are learning and development professionals, and what we should be doing is demonstrating those risks ourselves so that we can sell that back to the business more effectively.
Do you not think that we take risks all the time? In the sense that we will be like, MOOCs are fashionable, let's start a MOOC, or badges are fashionable, let's do badges. And I think one of the problems is, instead of we're not going fast enough, is that we are going too fast. We need to slow right down. We do a MOOC, it's absolutely pants, and we think, MOOCs are shit, we're not going to do them anymore. Actually, we need to run another 50 MOOCs and get better at what we're doing, and not rush off to the next thing.
But then that means using data and evidence to justify the decisions that we've been making, rather than just trying it once, seeing if it's a success, and then either continuing or discarding with it. And I think that's part of the issue we've got from the learning and development profession, is we don't sit and work out and say, is this absolutely effective or not? And as a consequence, I think one of the challenges is we don't move things on fast enough, because what we want to do is we want to see the evidence that sits behind it. I know that sounds really confusing argument, but we don't move quick enough because we need more evidence, and then we move too slowly because we're still waiting for evidence to demonstrate that something works.
Yeah, I mean, I can understand that to a certain extent. It's almost as if we're in such a rush to try out new things that we're not going about it in a way where we can actually figure out whether these things actually work for the purpose that we are using them for or not. And so the very fact that we're not trying to figure out whether these things work or not, but we're just trying them out, means that as a whole, we're moving more slowly.
Yeah, absolutely. And so there's an inertia that builds up, because it's like, I've got to try MOOCs, or I've got to try podcasts, or I've got to try video, or I've got to try, animated short films. And everybody tries everything all at once, rather than sitting, pausing and working out, well, what needs to be taken forward, which is fine if we're doing that in the business, because you can pilot things in the business. But as a profession, we need to look at ourselves and say, well, how do I as an individual develop myself forward? And I think there is a challenge there, because there is so much technology available for us now that I could learn how to do podcasting. Is it a skill I need to know? Maybe, maybe not. Is my business going to ask for it? Maybe, maybe not. So what we do is we don't do anything around it. We sit and wait, and we let somebody else do it for us.
Oh, the world needs another L&D podcast, like A Hole in the Head. I think we can all agree. There are a lot of them just now.
There are an awful lot of podcasts just now, and that's not a criticism of any podcast in particular.
No.
Quite the opposite. I think it's great that people are going out and doing podcasts. However, what we need to say is that a skill that we need? Do we need a technology for it? Do we need to see evidence that these things work? And how do we skill up the profession to be able to do these things? Because guess what? There probably will be a demand for them in the future. I know there's an awful lot of them at the moment, but maybe there will still be a need for them. So as a consequence, don't we need to develop some people's skills to do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think with podcasts in particular, this being a topic close to my heart, we are in the animated unicorn GIF and background MIDI music phase of podcasts. It's incredibly accessible. Anyone can make a podcast at all, which means that everyone makes a podcast. And here's a frank admission. I don't think the first 20 Good Practice podcasts are particularly up to snuff because it took us that long to work out what we were doing with it. And that is kind of a parable for anything that you try in the L&D profession, particularly because we've got a weird job in the first place. You're always trying to do stuff that's kind of outside your remit. I'm going to be an audio engineer today because I quite fancy starting podcasts. That's totally different to what you would be trained in.
Yeah. I think if I can offer some ballast to some of what Andrew's talking about, by saying, first of all, we can trot out William Gibson once again and say that the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. I think that's true, but I don't think it's unique to learning and development. So if I take software development as to look at an alternative domain, the Agile Manifesto got posted 17 years ago, and many organizations, in fact, I was speaking to one just today, that they have very recently started to look at how they develop their internal systems using agile practices. And so it's kind of gone from a few disgruntled developers to sweeping across early adopters, and is only just now hitting the mainstream. And along the way, they have found stumbling blocks and issues and key challenges and the issues of deploying this kind of stuff in the enterprise world. And it's got to the point where there's still lots of debate about whether it's any good and whether there are better, more nuanced approaches. I mean, that's kind of familiar to what's happening in learning and development, which is, here's the new thing, it's the greatest thing ever, and then once the majority start adopting some of those practices, like, that thing's rubbish, let's move on to the next new exciting thing. And so you see exactly the same stuff in marketing, where fast-moving companies are streets ahead of slower-moving organizations, but the profession as a whole moves much more slowly than the headline stories. In generally, though, I think in a better direction.
I would tend to agree with you. My frustration is when you still see people desperately keen to want to understand how to use Kirkpatrick more effectively.
But that's not necessarily a problem
yes.
with the person, though, is it? Is this Kirkpatrick's widespread? So it's a signal that they want to evaluate. They are keen to do better evaluation. They're just not sure how. And Kirkpatrick's a model that seems to offer that tantalizing opportunity that you can do it. The urge is there, right? They just don't know where to go with it.
Which is why my blog's called Lost and Desperate, because people are lost or they're desperate. They're lost, they want to do something better, but they don't know how. They're desperate, they want to do it better, but they don't know how to access it. So, it's that's where the blog title comes from. And I accept that as well. My issue with it is that I don't think necessarily people want to do evaluation better. What they want is to be able to use Kirkpatrick better, because that's the model that they work to. And it's where the models have become so stuck. I did I don't know if you saw, I stuck a tweet out a little while ago, which sort of like took the mickey out of MBTI.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's currently just over 1 million views now. It's like, if you want to talk viral, this is what viral is. But the number of people who replied to it. Well, exactly. The number of people who replied to it going, it was comparing MBTI to horoscopes. So you could be an EFPJ. I don't even know what the letters are. INTJ, I think, is one of them. Gemini, for example. Yeah, and then some people were actually replying back on those terms going, because I'm an EFPJ Leo or whatever. And actually, subscribing to it and using those models. And I think that's one of the issues we've got, is that, are we doing ourselves a disservice by still hanging on to these models and not driving things through?
So, I mean, part of me thinks that you're just baiting people on Twitter And so that attracts a certain kind of person, and that is unfair to cast an entire profession in the light of those that would respond to your tweet. I used to, in fact, I'm still friends with a guy who used to write horoscopes for a living. And he was a content writer. And he said it was a spectacularly difficult job because it had to be specific enough to apply to everyone, vague enough to apply to everyone. So it was just so difficult. Everyone had to recognize themselves for every single one of the months, and you had to do that every single week. So there's a skill there as well, but that's a different topic.
Yeah, that's the Barnum effect, I think it's called, isn't it, off the top of my head?
Do you not find that when you meet people in our profession, they are all enthusiastic and passionate, and they're trying really hard, they work within tremendous constraints, they often have leaders who expect a certain thing from the training function, and learners have a certain expectation of how they're going to be trained, and you're trying to challenge everyone else's mindset before you can do any of this stuff.
That's a really interesting point, and I think that's particularly interesting now because we're seeing a different breed of people coming into learning and development. It's something I've noticed probably over the last 18 months or so. We're not getting people who've come in through the traditional routes of CIPD or LPI, for example, and what they're doing is they're coming in now with the experience from the workplace because they become used to learning in a different way, and as a consequence they want to try and shape that and apply that. The frustration I think that we will have is when they find that they can't move further because there's an expectation that they still have to work to those existing models.
So do you think, how widespread do you think that is, Andrew? Because I think when we're talking about, are we feeling our profession, I don't get the sense that you are, for example, looking at Kirkpatrick and thinking that's a great model for us doing evaluation. So you're doing something different. And my experience of conversations that we've had is that you are focusing in on what are the business issues, not just the issues coming in necessarily from the top, but capturing and helping with challenges that people are dealing with day to day. So you're having conversations with business leaders around what's important, what's difficult, what's stopping you from achieving those objectives, and you are channeling the activity of your L&D team towards, or I can't remember if it's learning and development or OD that you're looking after, but you're challenging the activities of your team towards helping people deal with those business issues. And I speak to a lot of learning leaders who are exactly the same, but I'm aware that there are other people out there. So I think it would be interesting to know what kind, how many people are laggards in this conversation and how many people are trying to push through.
That's a really interesting question because although you actually hit the nail on the head there, because you said you don't know whether I'm L&D or something else. Well, actually I am L&D, but I don't think the nature of the role of L&D is L&D anymore. I think it's much wider than that. I think we're doing OD to an extent, we're doing talent, we're working on structural change, we're working on coaching and counselling, senior managers, we're looking at systems integration and working from an IT perspective. There's a whole cultural piece.
Recruitment,
I think
marketing.
Absolutely. And traditionally, learning has been just that tiny little skills bit, that bit around skills and behaviour. And now people are going to the learning function saying we want a bit more now. So in terms of failing the profession, is there something about, we need to skill people up on those other areas a little bit better, rather than just the core skills around training, in inverted commas? How
do we skill people up as well? Do you mean in terms of like formal qualifications? Like how do you, this might be an utter rabbit hole. How far is L&D even a profession?
Oh, that's a really great question. So I work for the civil service. In the civil service, we've got 20 odd professions. From tax is a profession, HR is a profession, etc. There is no learning profession.
No. And when you came into the HMRC, which I imagine must be the most agile, forward-thinking company you could possibly have arrived at, did you find that you were bringing in wild maverick views, or were people quite receptive to what you had to say?
Oh yeah, Ross
lost your signal there, guys.
Disappeared. Oh, there we go.
Yeah, well, how's this for a conspiracy theory? So I was criticising Her Majesty's government, and my internet dropped out.
Yeah. GC GCHQ heard you and stopped you.
Yeah.
I did hear the question. It was something along the lines of my mad, wonderful ideas coming into a really forward-thinking organisation.
Exactly. I was wondering if you were embraced with open arms or whether you found resistance from HMRC.
Firstly, HMRC is a forward-thinking organisation to the point where we're being asked now to slow down on our digital tax, digital VAT next year. They've actually asked us to slow it down because they don't think that the country's ready for it. So we're actually ahead of the curve, which I think is interesting. I think what's really interesting is around the learning and development space is there's lots of people who really want to drive learning forward, and we're really trying to do things differently. And it's working across a wide organisation. I mean, there's 68,000 people who work in HMRC across many, many, many sites. So to establish a consistency, not a uniformity, but a consistency of approach, a consistency of strategy, and a consistency of delivery actually becomes quite complex. And everybody, we seem to forget, wants to do a good job. Everybody wants to do the right thing. What I'm finding really interesting is we don't necessarily understand what the right thing is. And that's where I'm trying to help.
So that's kind of where this conversation is going, I think, is what should we be doing differently if we're failing our profession, which I'm not convinced that we are. What would you like to see us be doing differently?
Stop doing just the skills bit, because we're not just about skills and behaviour. And don't be afraid to look up and out and look at everything else that's happening. Your finance function wouldn't work in complete isolation from the IT function, for example. So the learning function needs to work a lot more closely with the IT function and also with the finance function. And just working, not be afraid to think of ourselves as organisational development and performance support, not just really nice people who do training courses.
And that is another one of the big challenges, isn't it? Is I mean, Ross mentioned this. It's around expectation. We're called learning and development. People expect us to deal with formal learning because that's what they think of when they hear the word learning. So you've got that expectation barrier to overcome, but also our own internal barriers. I think we almost care too much about learning and not nearly enough about performance. So we see learning, if not the only route, then the primary route towards performance improvement, and we don't focus nearly enough about removing requirements for learning from the workflow, which doesn't mean stop all your formal stuff or more formal stuff, but it does mean let's cut out the unnecessary learning, the stuff that can be outsourced somewhere else.
It's about thinking strategically but acting tactically. That's fundamentally it. So doing activity which is going to support the business as what's required within the business, rather than just doing the thing you've always done.
But where do we get the right to go to the IT department and to say the main thing slowing down everyone's performance at work is this crappy system that you installed? And while there might be reasons for you having done that, it is having a major impact on how people perform, and no amount of training is going to solve that problem.
Same as to why should the IT system or the IT function go to learning and go, we're going to install this IT system and we need you to train everybody on the technicalities that sit around it so that everybody can do their job, because this system's costing us lots of money. It's no different, is it?
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, fair enough. I was thinking back to that thing where, when if the system requires training on it, it's probably not designed very well.
Yeah, build for user experience, absolutely.
Yeah. So what are some of the barriers that we face to doing this? Why don't people do it now?
So Clayton Christensen, we all know his book, The Innovator's Dilemma. He actually did a really interesting book on education in the States. And he identified that there's 4 factors that will limit innovation. And he puts these 4 things as, the first one is lateral. And by that, people need to see examples of other people doing this stuff elsewhere so that they don't think they're putting their head above the parapet and they're the first people to do it. Secondly is temporal, and that's about doing the thing at the right time. So that what you get is when you try and change something, people will say, well, now's not the right time because. And so it's trying to find, well, when the right time should be and pin people down to that. The third one is physical, because while we have classrooms, for example, then we're expected to run classes within them. While we have trainers in our structures, we've expected them to do training. So the structure limits what we can do. And then lastly, there's hierarchy. And so who actually gives us permission for us to do things differently? So lateral, temporal, physical, hierarchical.
It's interesting. So the lateral one is interesting because I think we almost need to have a different way of people sharing what they're doing differently. So if I think about case studies that I see at conferences, it has the veneer of someone sharing, here's what we're doing, but it doesn't have the kind of in-depth, look, this is what it's really like, and these are where all the lumps and bumps are with this particular experience. And it's not perfect and it's not brilliant, but it is a step on. And here's literally how we're measuring how effective this stuff is. What you get instead is something that's incredibly polished around sharing what people are up to. And part of me thinks you need some of the professional bodies to start shaking some of that up so that there's a better opportunity for people to share what they're actually doing differently.
There were 3 points around that. Firstly, if I was going to present at a conference, I would not be allowed to show warts and all. And I don't know how many other businesses would do the same as well.
What a great conference session it would be, though. We tried this, and this is how much it cost before we decided it was a failure.
I would love a fail conference. I would love people to go along to a fail conference.
That would be so good, yeah.
It would be, but which businesses are really going to put their hands up and go, yeah, we'll run a fail conference, which I think would be really, really challenging. The second one is to do with how those stories are written. And if you've not had a look at it, have a look at the hero's journey piece, because that's the core narrative that tends to sit around all stories that tend to be published. I highly, highly recommend it. And it's all about somebody has misfortune, finds a new way, gets a mentor, chooses that new path, struggles against themselves, and then eventually ultimately is successful. Look at any case study and you can apply the hero's journey across to it. And the third one is, again, Christensen. He talks about two forms of innovation: sustaining innovation and disruptive innovation. And I think what we get in a lot of case studies is we get a lot of sustaining innovation, where people take the same idea and innovate that idea. And so what they're doing is they're disrupting, or they're innovating within a certain sphere, as opposed to disruptive innovation, which is where someone does something completely different. And those are ones that don't tend to be caught at conferences anyway.
I think we talked before in this podcast about survivorship bias, where you have the likes of Richard Branson and Steve Jobs and Jeff Bezos are held up as, this is what a CEO looks like. They are disruptors. They're the disruptors that survive to the very end. They are not indicative of every other CEO.
Absolutely. And everybody who's copied their ideas, they're not disrupting to the same level. So you can only disrupt, arguably, you can only disrupt once. You can disrupt the book selling. You can disrupt the fast food. You can disrupt Uber, cab services, for example. You can only disrupt each of those things once until you find another need which can then be put together and created. And I think what we're seeing a lot with some of the case study things in terms of the lateral stuff is lots of people doing things slightly differently. Yeah. It's the same thing, but just rolled up and folded differently.
But there's a couple of things to go alongside that. One is that genuine disruption doesn't happen all that often, and the survival rate is relatively low. So, if you're trying out things and they're disruptive, it's more likely than not that it's going to fail. You need some kind of protection there to do that.
Oh, absolutely. And one person's disruption is another person's common practice. It's only disruptive if you haven't heard of it.
So one of the things I thought was, there is another way for this to happen, and it's for an external shock to force change. And you've had some experience of this at the
Lambeth Council, yeah.
Yep. Where the shock was the financial crash and the incredible cuts that were coming along that both forced you to change, but also gave you an opportunity as well.
Yeah. Innovation happens on the edges. And it does entirely, yeah. The situation we were in was that the budget was cut from 2010 to when I left in 2014. It was cut by 46%. We still had the same number of residents. We had a reduced number of employees, but there was still an expectation that people needed learning. And so we had to think about, well, how could we do it differently? So we did.
But one of the ways you did that was you just stopped doing courses, wasn't it?
Yeah, I just withdrew all courses for 3 months.
Because that is something that I think people listening to this, particularly if they have any kind of face-to-face role, will have bumped against was one of the physical structures you were talking about. Changing the physical structure was sacking the trainers and turning the classrooms into something else.
Yeah.
That's quite an extreme approach to doing this.
It is an extreme approach, but what we did is we took our training rooms and we made them rooms where people could learn. So what we did, for example, is instead of running a presentation skills course, what we did is we made the room available for people to book themselves in to do presentations. And when we had enough people together, we then ran the session, we loaded up a laptop and people practiced in front of other people. So it became a space for learning, but without it necessarily being a training course, for example.
Did that meet resistance?
Initially. Because unless you're in a classroom with a big neon sign saying learning, then people didn't necessarily think they were getting it. We were very lucky because the council at the time, Lambeth Council, was trying to become a cooperative council. And that was working on the premise that everybody in the borough had something to offer, and the answer that we would need would be in the borough somewhere. And so it was just a case of helping people connect and find out how to do things.
So that is an extreme way of doing things, is to say we're not going to do any courses for 3 months. We're going to change our classrooms into a different kind of a learning space. Most learning departments don't have that same immediacy to them. They don't have this external pressure. And so they're fine to do exactly as they have been doing because there's no reason for them to stop. People will stop when there's actually a need to rather than just them wanting to. And it becomes much easier to make your case to do that when you can say, I don't have any money. So short of throwing your budget away, what's the need to actually change?
Well, it's going to happen anyway. We're already seeing it. People, I love the idea of reverse Superman, that someone's a Superman outside work, and then when they come into the office, we force them to fit a certain constraint. And people aren't necessarily like that. What they're doing is they're coming into work. If they can't do something on Excel, they'll look it up on their mobile phone. So it's already being disrupted. We're already changing the nature of how this learning stuff happens. And we're seeing it all over the place. I don't know, the John Ronson podcast series, The Butterfly Effect. In that, he talked about disruption of the porn industry, where a guy created Pornhub and basically made all porn available for free. And you could argue that learning development's similar, that all learning had to be constrained within a classroom, or you had to buy a book or whatever. Now all that stuff's available for free. If I want to learn how to do something, I can sign up to a MOOC. I can do 3-4 weeks of the course, haven't got to pay anybody anything for it, learn the stuff I need and then walk away. So I get that ultimate satisfaction at the end of it without having to go through all of the process in the first place. And if your learning function isn't aware of that, well, then you're just going to become defunct. Yeah,
I guess if you're looking at the, there's going to be some burning need to change. There has to be some burning need to learn as well. And oftentimes what L&D is doing is not providing people with stuff that they actually need.
I think the challenge there is when the business gets smart to the fact that learning doesn't need to be doing the learning stuff, or they don't need learning to be doing the learning stuff, when it can be done by other people. So when a CEO thinks that they go to the learning function, then realises, you know what, I don't necessarily have to. I can go to this place or to that place, or they can do that for me, instead of having to pay out this money for this cost centre. That's when it will change. So there may not be a burning platform now, but if you're not looking all upwards and outwards, it is going to happen anyway.
Yeah.
You're building your house on sand.
Yeah. I think there's if nothing else, I think there are a lot of the people in the profession who would like to be having more of an impact. And step one is figuring out which stuff we do actually works and which stuff we can happily cut away or at least reduce significantly. It's that, in a lot of ways, there's quite a bit of activity in L&D that is nice to have that if you were to ask business leaders, they would not say that it's absolutely imperative that we have X, Y, or Z. And if you've got too much of that, the accountants will quickly turn their eyes speedily on it, especially during a period where costs are being reduced. And so we've been fortunate not to have a shock since 2008, but one might very well be on its way. I would be looking at that stuff quite carefully right now if I was leading a learning function.
Oh, you're the first person I've heard say something to suggest that we don't have a much brighter future ahead in the coming months. Are we failing our profession? Much sharp intakes of breath.
Who's the we?
We L&D/ODU professionals, the kind that would listen to a podcast about L&D.
You see, this is the thing. You see, I think the audience here, and what a wonderful audience you have, Ross.
Pandering.
Absolutely. I think the audience here would probably go, no, we're not. And I do wonder whether the audience who need to hear it aren't necessarily the people who would listen to this podcast.
All right.
Yes. It's exactly that. I mean, we're talking about what is the distribution that we're seeing across the L&D profession. How many people are early adopters who are conscious and aware of that, and where does the line come in that distribution in terms of the people who are genuinely switched off and are just delivering communication skills for the 14th time this year? I actually don't know the answer to that question, because we've got a view, but we only interact with the people that we interact with. My sense is that it's probably slightly more positive than the episode title might suggest, but that is heavily influenced by the people that I interact with most frequently. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah, it's a self-selection bias. Yeah. Well, if anyone at home knows someone who they think could be not failing their profession, but might be just now, be sure to recommend this podcast to them. It's available on iTunes, everywhere else you get your podcast. Leave a review, share it widely, wherever you want. You're doing the whole profession a massive service by sharing this podcast. For now, though, we will move on to a regular feature of What I Learned This Week, where we each share something we picked up over the past 7 days. Owen, do you want to go first?
Sure thing. I have become slightly obsessed with the World Chess Championship over the last couple of weeks. So Magnus Carlsen.
I play chess every single day.
Oh yes, of course you do. You do the online chess thing.
I've got online chess with my brother and 2 friends.
So the World Chess Champion, Magnus Carlsen, who's the Norwegian current world champion and considered by some to be the greatest chess player ever, is playing the world number 2 Fabiano Caruana. And there is a prize fund of over €1 million for this match. So chess is a bigger thing than I was expecting. But
spectator chess too.
Yeah, I know people are watching and they're enclosed in this soundproof booth. But what really caught my eye was the in-game analysis that takes place that you can see on various different sites. Basically, based on each move, it is possible to calculate who is ahead of the game. So you've got a computer that basically looks at the position of all the pieces and gives a rating as to which player is in the best position and their chance of winning the game. And the reason it can do this is because the computer knows all of the best moves to make every single time. Because we're living in an age where computers are just better at chess than people, completely. Right? There's zero doubt about this. And so what you've got is a world championship for the best human at chess, and but there's still £1 million going to this. So if you really wanted to see someone extraordinary at chess, right, better than any human who's ever lived, you would just watch a computer play against itself.
I would loop that back to Andrew's hero's journey and the Vladimir prop tropes. It's that we want to see someone struggle and then succeed. We don't want to see 2 machines going at it.
Yeah. I find it absolutely fascinating, and I say that as someone who is watching it. So I am paying attention to this, and at the same time I'm looking at it and thinking, computers are much better at chess than this pair that's knocking it out here. But it's extraordinary.
There's a great book by Stefan Zweig. It's really short. You'd read it in like 2 hours or something like that. It's called Chess, and it discusses, it's a novella, why chess is the greatest game in the world. And the reason is that it's got no element of chance to it. It is entirely skill, unlike most other tabletop games. This podcast was brought to you by chess. Andrew, what have you learned this week?
Nothing as significant. There are three little things actually. The first one, I heard a fabulous word the other day, which I think is one that I'm probably going to end up using myself. Procrastinating, which is the work you do while you procrastinate is probably the work you should be doing. I just love that idea, that phrasing. I just think that's really quite nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you're choosing to do something that you're genuinely more engaged with, and you're putting off something that you're utterly dreading.
Absolutely. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean it's the right thing to be doing, but I just procrastinating, I think, is quite nice. The second one was that the first AI written advert has been filmed and broadcast.
Was it the Elton John one?
No, it wasn't. It was an advert for. It was strangely enough. No, it was an advert for. Strangely enough, a Tesla car.
Ah.
And what this AI or computer written advert was that the car became sentient, and actually then protected itself. Which scared the pants off me, to be honest. I highly recommend you look it up.
Androids do dream of electric sheep.
Absolutely. Which I just thought, okay, we're probably closer to the truth maybe than we thought we were before. And my last thing I learnt was actually yesterday, was that Kate Middleton only carries 4 items in her handbag, which I thought was quite interesting.
Are you leaving it there?
Do we know what those 4 items are?
Well, I thought it might be Conquest, War, Famine and Death, the 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse, because wouldn't that be fun? But no, I it's something to do with a blotting paper, apparently, for when she gets sweaty hands, a compact mirror, the usual stuff. But so I'll bear that in mind the next time I have to carry 4 items in a bag.
This has been a wide-ranging podcast, and I'm going to close it with the story of the sour toe cocktail. In the 1920s, Yukon local Louis Lycan had his frostbitten toe amputated, then preserved it in a jar of alcohol in his cabin, where it remained for 50 years. In 1973, Captain Dick Stevenson found the jar, brought it to the Sourdough Saloon, and started dropping it into people's drinks, giving birth to the sour toe cocktail. In 1980, a miner named Gary Younger was on his 13th glass of sour toe champagne when he tipped it over backwards and swallowed the toe. The toe was not recovered. Since then, 7 more toes have been donated, and some have had frostbite and some have had corns. Some were donated in return for free drinks. The current toe was delivered to the bar in a jar of alcohol with the message, "Don't wear open-toe sandals while mowing the lawn."
Oh.
Of all the toes, 3 have been swallowed, 1 deliberately, for which the culprit paid a fine of $500. The bar has since raised that fine to $2,500 to discourage others. The sour toe can be paired with any drink, but has one rule. You can drink it fast, you can drink it slow, but the lips have got to touch the toe. And on that delicious note, let's wrap up our show.
Yes.
That's a true story. I know that sounded like a fiction. That is a true story.
I have heard that. I have actually heard that. And yeah, it's frightful.
That's from a fantastic website called Atlas Obscura, which is all sorts of weird and wonderful facts from around the world. I'd like to thank Andrew and Owen for their contributions this week, and everyone at home for listening. If you'd like to get in touch with us about anything we've said on this show, you can tweet me at RossGarnerGP. You can tweet Owen
at Owen Ferguson.
And you can tweet Andrew
at Andrew Jacobs LD.
You can also tweet at GoodPractice or at GoodPracticeAUS. You can find out more about us at goodpractice.com, and Andrew blogs at lostanddesperate.com. We'll have links to all of those strange references in the show notes. Next week, it's our annual Christmas special. Yes, 12 months have come and gone. We are ready to say farewell to 2018 the way that we lived it, with community spirit, togetherness, trust, and goodwill to all people. So make sure you subscribe now, wherever you get your podcasts, and we will deliver 30 minutes of festive cheer into your ear holes next Tuesday. Until then, bye for now. And I'll probably pay some jingle bells as I'm saying that.
Yes, of course you will. Of course you will.